Hello, welcome everyone. This is Becca Clark, and I'm a student recruiter for our Master of Applied Leadership and Management program at Thunderbird. And I would like to introduce you to Dr. Ted Cross, Clinical Assistant Professor of Leadership and Academic Director of our Master of Applied Leadership and Management program. Thank you, Dr. Cross.
First, I'd like to thank Becca for the introduction and welcome you all out to the webinar today. This webinar is on the science of happiness, and we hope that you take away a few practical tips to help you in your own life improve your happiness. I wanted to start out with a story. Recently, my wife and I moved to a new apartment, and we have moved a lot of times. My wife's in real estate, and all of our stuff is still in boxes. We're about 2 weeks into the move, and most of our things are still in boxes stacked along the back wall. And what we're noticing is that on a day-to-day basis, we don't use a lot of those things that are in those boxes. Many of you may have had the same experience. You've moved or you've found things in a storage unit that were in boxes that you had put away because you just knew that you would need those sometime in the future. And later you found out actually you didn't miss them at all after they had been in storage or in boxes for a number of years even. So we're starting to experience the same thing on a day-to-day basis. We're not using 80% of the stuff that we have accumulated over time and when we move put into boxes. So this got me thinking about this topic of the science of happiness and whether or not in a culture, particularly in Western society, but also just the globalization and across the world, has increased consumption, and whether or not buying stuff, getting more conspicuous consumption per se actually increases happiness. And so today I'd like to go through a few things that the research is actually telling us and informing us about how we can improve our happiness and well-being. And some of those things are actually different than we think. So a number of years ago, I was introduced to the field of positive psychology in an interesting way. I was at graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, and my wife, Stephanie, was working for a foundation called the Templeton Foundation. The Templeton Foundation was funding professors' research on positive psychology, in particular, the man you see on your screen, Martin Seligman. Now, Martin Seligman is the former president of the American Psychological Association, and he's a very prominent researcher in the field of clinical psychology, but he is also known as the father of positive psychology. One night, my wife came to me and she said, "We have to go to this party for my work. I'm low man on the totem pole, and so we have to go to this party and show up, and it's for Martin Seligman because we're funding some of his research." Well, I didn't know much about Martin Seligman at the time, but we went to his house outside of Philadelphia, and we got to meet him and learn a little bit about his work. And that's when I started really diving into the research of positive psychology. Now, positive psychology, just from a definitional standpoint, is the attempt to scientifically study and quantify the best parts of human experience. That's Tal Ben-Shahar that I'm quoting from Harvard University. So the problem that Seligman, from the previous slide, says that traditional psychology has is that it's pathological in nature. Now, what does he mean by that? He gives an example. If you sat on an airplane and you found out that your seatmate next to you was a psychologist, what would be one of the first things that would come through your mind? Now, I'll tell you what would come through my mind, and that would be that I would be wondering, oh man, I hope the psychologist who's sitting next to me doesn't figure out what's wrong with me or start analyzing me, right? And that is exactly Seligman's point, is that psychology is often about figuring out what's wrong with people and helping them fix what's wrong. Now, that's very useful. It's very useful to bring people who are at a -10 to a 0. But Seligman's question was, how can we actually build upon the positive traits that people have and bring people who are at a 0 per se in happiness or well-being and bring them to a +5 or a 2 even? How can we help people improve upon their strengths, identify actual scientific interventions that would improve people's lives, rather than going from a deficit model that traditional psychology does, which is just about how do we rectify problems. Now, like I said before, if you have a broken leg, it's often better to not have a broken leg, but it's even better to have a non-broken leg that is very strong. And that's sort of the idea of positive psychology. Seligman invented a framework that we'll be using throughout the rest of this presentation. And on each page, you'll see this PERMA model that I'll describe here in a second. It's a mnemonic to remember some different aspects. But what Seligman found out, particularly at the beginning of the positive psychology movement, is that it wasn't enough just to study happiness, but also that scientists need to find out a little bit more about well-being. And the reason for that is that happiness is an emotional state. Actually, the word happiness comes from the same root word happenstance. It's something that may or may not happen. It's fleeting. And so when we feel happy, we feel an emotional high, which is great, but it's not often lasting. And so Seligman decided to start rolling happiness into a better term, in his opinion, and in other positive psychology researchers' opinions, of well-being, meaning happiness and meaning in some other things. So PERMA is the model, and what PERMA stands for, P is positive emotions, E is engagement, R is relationships, and M is meaning, and A is achievement. Now, what we really want to focus on here is that this framework is trying to bring about an array of different areas in which you can achieve well-being and happiness. It doesn't mean you have to have all of them at once. It doesn't mean that one is better than another, but it's different aspects of well-being and happiness categorized so that we can study interventions and actually study what things might help us. So here you can see those defined, and you see that each of the bubbles actually overlap, and so that is a way to indicate that actually these things are not totally separate, but they run one into the other. So what Seligman is really saying is that it's not enough just to have positive emotions. You also need to have engagement in your life. Think about the last time you lost yourself in playing a video game or a sport or reading a really good book. You're very engaged. You need to have positive relationships. You need to find meaning in your life, either through work or through volunteer work or other types of work, or actually recreation and accomplishment. So some of us find accomplishment in our jobs, other of us find accomplishment in our recreational activities. The argument is here that if we can improve in these domains, we can find greater happiness and well-being. Now, I wanted to set that up because it's important to have a framework to start before we diving into some of the interventions. Oftentimes, what we think of, and one of the questions I get a lot, is what actual things in my life can I do to make myself happier or those around me happier? How can I improve my well-being? And that's a tough question. There's lots and lots of things we can do to improve that, but there's some interesting studies that teach us some very important principles. One question that often comes up is what I'd like to talk about on the next slide, which is, what about money? Can money really buy me happiness? And traditionally, the answer has always been no, money can't buy you happiness. And we all know people who are very well off that actually are not happy at all. We also know people who are very well off that we wouldn't say have great well-being. However, recently there's some studies that have come out that have shown that actually money can buy you happiness up to a certain point. So Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winning economist. He, quote unquote, invented behavioral economics. And at Princeton University, some colleagues did a large study to find out, did different income levels produce greater happiness in individuals? In other words, if you earn more money, did it increase your happiness? And what they found was something very interesting. On the left-hand side, you see my notes, and I also have a little graphic of the PERMA model because I want to point to that at the end of our discussion on this slide. But on the right-hand side, you also see a map, which I'll describe here in a second. What the researchers found is that at about $75,000 a year in the United States, up to that point is a ceiling of increasing happiness. So in other words, if you make $75,000 and up to that point, if you are earning up to $75,000, it does actually affect your happiness. After $75,000, what the researchers found is that it really doesn't change your happiness that much. So there's not an additive effect on top of $75,000. It's just up to $75,000. Now, the map on the right-hand side is actually showing relative to the cost of living in different regions of the United States. So for example, if you live in California, you need to earn, $90,000, and above that, it won't affect your happiness, but below that, it does. And so you can actually check out this map on the Huffington Post, use the data from the Princeton study, and you can, it's an interactive map, and you can check out your state if you're in the US. There's also studies all over the world that use similar data that you can look at your country too. And so does money buy happiness? The answer is depends, right? It depends. If you're not making enough money to quote unquote meet your basic needs, depending on the cost of living in your current region, it will greatly affect your happiness. You need to have enough resources to be able to survive and then be able to find meaning in your life. The other interesting finding from this study is that they looked at happiness, which we just talked about, which there's a ceiling at around 75,000 relatively. But there's also a different metric they looked at, life satisfaction. So how satisfied are you with your life as you sort of retrospectively look back at your life? Are you satisfied with the way things have gone, your accomplishments, all those things? So it's a different measure than happiness. It's related but different. And what these researchers found is that that money, the more you earn, the higher your life satisfaction, and there was no ceiling. So in the case of happiness, you get to about 75,000 and there's no more additive effect above and beyond, increasing happiness above and beyond 75,000. But what they found for life satisfaction is actually that it keeps going up. So the more money you earned per year, the higher you were likely to rate your life satisfaction score. Now that's a different measure. So that's the answer of can you really buy happiness with money? It really depends on the way you're looking at it. Now there's another way to look at this also, how you spend your money. And the reason I'm starting with money is because people often really wonder about this right off the bat. They think happiness and they think about money, and does this really help or not? So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a picture of my wife and I and my cousins who took us to the Jimmy Fallon show a couple years ago. The Super Bowl was in town here in Phoenix, and Jimmy Fallon does his show from wherever the Super Bowl is being broadcast that year. And my cousin was lucky enough to get tickets. And this was a picture we took as we were waiting in line for hours and hours to get into that show. And so what the reason I put this and tell this story and put this up here is that I don't remember a lot of the things that I have in those boxes that I bought that are sitting in my apartment right now. Lots of the things I spent lots and lots of money on. But I really remember this experience that I had with my family members going to the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. And so researchers are finding that actually if you spend your money on stuff, you're less likely to increase your happiness than if you spend your money on experiences. Now, they're doing other studies that show that millennials are sort of in line with this. Younger people are starting to find out that they rather spend on experiences than stuff also, and it's a trend. And so it might seem obvious to younger generations, but to older generations, this wasn't always the case. We thought perhaps if we bought the BMW that we would feel happier, and then we found out that we didn't. But what is actually happening is that if you spend on experiences, it's categorically increasing happiness. In fact, for millennials, just a couple years ago, it was the first time in the United States that millennials had spent more money on eating out than on purchasing stuff at shopping malls, on clothing in particular. And so we're seeing a shift in consumer behavior that is actually in a line with the research that says, if you want to increase your happiness, you're better off to spend on experiences. Quick side note here is that I'm a professor, so I always look at these lots and lots of studies. I looked at a study that was trying to measure the effect of happiness on whether or not you took a long vacation or many short vacations. So the researchers wanted to find out, is it better to take many short vacations to increase your happiness, or is it better to take just a few long ones? And what they found was that it was better in the research when they polled the participants to take a lot of short vacations. And one of the reasons why is because we often find pleasure in the anticipation of a vacation rather than just in the vacation. Plus, we're making many more experiences that we can have. How many of us have had a very bad vacation that we spent a lot of time waiting for? Might have been better to spread the risk out, right? And have a few more vacations instead. Let me mention one more thing around how we spend money. It's also important, there are a lot of studies that are showing that charity or giving money away is another way to increase happiness. They also have found that actually, paradoxically, and this was a great book called Who Really Cares by Arthur C. Brooks up at, he's actually up in the northeast of the United States at a university up there. And what he found is that people who give away lots of money actually make more money in the long run. And it wasn't a chicken or egg sort of situation. It wasn't that, hey, people earned a lot of money, and once they earned a lot of money, then they started giving. Actually, what Arthur C. Brooks found is that people who consistently gave money throughout their lifetime, even if they hadn't accumulated a lot of wealth yet, actually earned more money in the long run. And so not only can giving money away or participating in charity or volunteer work help to increase your happiness, but it can also increase your bottom line. And we also have just seen that, hey, earning a little more money can help, okay? Now back to buying stuff. For example, that if we tie up a lot of our happiness in the idea that if I buy a BMW car, that I'll be very happy then once I buy that, there's a problem of habituation. And what happens is that we as human beings, once we buy something or we have a new product, it's really, really novel at the beginning. And we really find some enjoyment from that. There's no doubt about it. But after a while, we habituate. In other words, we get used to having the BMW, and it's not novel anymore, and it doesn't return happiness any longer. And so this is one of the reasons researchers think that it's less effective to spend money on stuff than it is to spend money on experiences or creating memories. And one of the reasons is we want to avoid this last bullet point here, which is getting on the hedonic treadmill. So hedonists, of course, are people who are seeking after pleasure. They're looking for one thing after another to satisfy themselves. And we all fall into this trap as human beings. How many times have you said to yourself, I'll be happy when, and fill in the blank with whatever thing or relationship or whatever into that blank. Then we get that thing or we achieve that goal and we don't feel that different. And so we say, well, when I get the next thing, and we're on a treadmill, we're walking on this treadmill, always seeking after the next greatest thing, instead of experiencing happiness now and using some of these tactics to actually help us. So, can money buy happiness? Yes, up to a certain point. Life satisfaction increases actually with increased income. And the way we spend our money is often very important. Now, what I'll argue here at the bottom on this PERMA model is that by spending on experiences, we're probably increasing positive emotions down in the lower left-hand corner. Oftentimes, if we are spending on an experience, for example, we are increasing positive relationships because we're probably with other people, like my example with the Jimmy Fallon Tonight Show experience that I had. And we might even find meaning interacting with others. Now, there's other ways to increase your happiness that we'll discuss. And don't worry, we're going to spend about 15 more minutes on, 10 to 15 more minutes on these slides, and then I'll open up questions at the end. I led with talking about happiness and money, but if I were to suggest to you one thing that you could do to increase your happiness and well-being, I would point to relationships. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you see a quote, and this is from Timothy Wilson from the University of Virginia. He's a personality psychologist, and he says, the number one predictor of how happy people are is the quality of their social relationships. In other words, if you really want to increase your happiness, work on your relationships. And so what researchers are finding over and over again is that the quality of our social relationships are really helping boost happiness, or on the negative side, decrease happiness. Probably because we make meaning in groups, probably because we're social animals. Cities actually over the last 50 years are increasing in size, and rural areas are actually hollowing out. Not to say you can't be happy in rural areas, but human beings are social animals. We tend to like to be with each other. And even if you're an introvert like me, I even admit I have to get out of my office every so often and go see some humans, right? And talk to other people and get some of that psychic energy. Also, we're influenced by each other. And so there's some interesting studies, for example, in health that are showing that, for example, our weight, how much we weigh, is the average of our 5 closest acquaintances or friends, because we are so influenced by people around us. They're also finding that happiness is also influenced by those people that we have around us. Now, one thing that is interesting to keep in mind on the relationship side is that it doesn't just affect your happiness, it can also affect your overall longevity. In other words, how long you live. There's 2 different studies I want to talk about here. One on the left-hand side and one on the right-hand side of your screen. So ignore the Venn diagram for 1 second. And on the left-hand side, we have a researcher, Mrs. Pinker, actually, and this is a TED Talk, you can look it up later. She is actually talking about some research done by some researchers at Brigham Young University. And what she found in a longitudinal study, they wanted to find out what are the best predictors of people being alive in 10 years from now. So they asked people a bunch of questions, then about their lifestyle, about their psychological well-being, and then they waited 10 years, these researchers, and then they saw who was still alive. And then they could find out through the research which factors were most predictive of people being alive in 10 years, okay, predicting longevity or how long you would live. Now, you can't see in this graphic very well, but I'll tell you what the predictors were. At the very, I'm actually going to start in the middle. The first thing that is very predictive is to quit drinking. It actually says quit boozing there. Then it says quit smoking, the next highest predictor of living longer. Then the next one to the top, second highest, is having close relationships as a very strong predictor of longevity. And the top, or the most predictive factor in living longer, is social integration. Social integration means that when you take your dog for a walk, do you talk to the guy at the coffee shop or the person you meet in the park or those kinds of things? Do you have a lot of loose ties or weak ties, as sociologists call them, that you interact with people? And so social integration is actually the number one predictor for longevity, as the researchers found in this study. Now, interestingly, you can look this up later, but a flu vaccine is more predictive than exercising every day. So it's actually more important to get a flu vaccine than it is to exercise every day if you want to live longer. Now, what we're finding here is some overlap at the very top of those most predictive factors, which are social integration and close relationships, is that happiness and longevity are related to 2 social factors. Remember the previous slide said, hey, the biggest predictor in how happy people are is the quality of their social relationships. And what this study is saying is, look, if you want to live longer and be happy, we talked about happy, but if you want to live longer, you need to have social integration and close relationships. So that's the first study. The second study on the right-hand side comes from National Geographic, did a very large study over a number of years, and they quantified it in a book called The Blue Zones. And what they were trying to find out is, why are there certain areas in the world where people live to be 100 or more? And they found that there was 3 concentrations of people that lived to be 100 or more. And one was in Loma Linda, California, and that's in the US. Sardinia, Italy was another place that has a lot of people who live to be over 100. And Okinawa, Japan was another place. So these 3 places, they said, let's study them and see if we can find out why people are living to 100 and beyond. And there's lots of factors, including some exercise patterns. So actually in all 3 of these places, people didn't have prescribed exercise regimens. In other words, they weren't going to gyms, but rather they got walking and climbing exercise in their day-to-day lives. So in Sardinia, it's very hilly, so they're climbing stairs a lot. In Okinawa, Japan, it's very common for the older people to help take care of the younger children, and so they're up and down a lot. In Loma Linda, California, it's the highest concentration of Seventh-day Adventists in the United States, and part of their religion is actually becoming in touch with nature, and they practice nature walks, and so that was one of the exercise components. But about 2 of the 4 common factors of all these areas are social in nature. And that was that people actually had close family ties and they had social integration again. So here we're finding that not only with happiness, but also with longevity, social is very, very important. Even for introverts like me, it's important for people to be social. Now, there's other ways, if you're not as social, you can improve your sociality, but there's also other ways to improve your happiness on a day-to-day basis on an individual bearing. So here on this slide, I want to just briefly cover, just for a couple minutes, the idea of journaling, meaning-making, and gratitude. And what we're finding, lots of researchers, including James Pennebaker at the University of Texas, Austin, is that people who keep a gratitude journal, in other words, writing down things you are thankful for every day, when they do studies of these folks, they find that people's happiness increase just by writing down the things you're grateful for. Another researcher found that actually even a better way to do the journaling activity is to write about things that you were grateful for, but in a way that were surprising. In other words, it was unlikely that X happened to you, or it was unlikely that you would have met X person. If you write about it in that framework, it's even more likely to increase your happiness. Also, we found that on the flip side, people who experience traumatic events in their lives often can benefit from journaling. So a common notion in clinical psychology and social work is that if someone experiences a traumatic event, they often want to bring in a bunch of social workers to start talking with these people right away to debrief them about this traumatic event. And what the research is now showing is that actually that's exactly the wrong thing to do. It cements the bad incident in the people's minds, and they have higher incidences of post-traumatic stress disorder. But if people have time to process that traumatic event on their own, and we give them space, and later on they either talk through it, through the event, or journal about it, they're able to make sense of a traumatic event. And by making sense of that traumatic event through writing or through talking it out with someone, are able to re-story that event in a way that makes sense and are able to move forward more likely. Now, this means that journaling can help us construct what psychologists call our own core narratives. These are the narratives that guide our lives. These are the things that as we look back and we write our life history, that we would say our turning points, our chapters, are things that have happened to us. And as we story that through writing, we can often craft our own core narrative in a way that we can adjust it. So in this case, with traumatic events, or having people write in journals and make sense of a traumatic event, and that's helping them move forward. You can also do the same thing on a positive side by writing about things you're grateful for, or writing about things that you would like to see happen, or writing about your best possible self. There's a famous prompt you can look up called the Best Possible Self prompt, where they increased undergraduates' well-being and happiness by having them write 3 days in a row about their best possible self and what that might look like. That's a great exercise too. So writing can help because it helps us make sense of negative things, but also helps us story the positive things and cement those into our minds. One more thing I'll mention is education and happiness. These are two different studies again. On the left-hand side was a study that showed well-being on the vertical axis and human capital on the horizontal axis. And what the researchers really meant by human capital was the number of people in a given area that had the qualifications, education, and training to be employable. And so really what this is a proxy measure of is educational attainment. And what you can see in this scatter plot graph is a very strong correlation between well-being and human capital, or in other words, education and training levels. So as education and training levels increase, so does well-being. Now, I might argue that also that one advantage of education or educating ourselves and being lifelong learners is that we experience achievement in that PERMA model that we talked about at the beginning. We often experience a social component, and in some ways we're also, if we're paying for the education, purchasing an experience. On the right-hand side, you see another study. This is one we're familiar with here in the US. Very often it shows that by degree attainment, earnings rise, and we've talked about a little bit today that increased income up to a certain point can increase happiness, and it can also help us be able to spend our money in ways that would actually benefit others, which increases happiness. That's one of the reasons you might be interested in the online Master of Applied Leadership and Management. If you are, please contact Becca or I. And I would like to leave this slide on for just one more second and say, these kinds of topics that we're discussing in these webinars are the things that we'll be talking about in the Master of Applied Leadership and Management. And so it's a leadership degree, and it can be finished in a year. We have scholarships available for folks who live in emerging markets, and have priced it competitively for people who live in the US to participate in this. It's designed for working professionals in a flexible online environment. Now, I have one more slide to show to sum up what we've talked about today.
Dr. Cross, we do have
Yes.
some questions that have come in.
Great.
Sorry to interrupt.
Please, let's take a couple questions.
Okay, first question from Mark. Would government providing a minimal guaranteed income raise national happiness? If so, what overall benefits would that provide?
Great question, Mark. There's actually a lot of economists who are studying this right now, and actually there's a movement to move towards gross national happiness as an economic indicator. And so there's a huge debate right now whether or not providing minimum guaranteed incomes, like is often done in Scandinavian countries, if that will actually increase happiness overall. The problem is teasing out all the confounding variables, because of course in the Scandinavian countries, what the economists have found is, yes, happiness is higher in those countries, but is it because there's a long-standing culture that is more socially minded and able to help each other in a way that is different, that just adding more money wouldn't? And so there is some debates about this. I suspect that some sort of safety net from a social standpoint often would increase happiness overall for government. So it's important for policymakers to look at this research and understand some of these implications.
Okay, next question from A.L. Sider. Can what people eat lend itself to their levels of happiness?
So I have not looked at a lot of the research on diet and happiness, but certainly there's been a lot of studies done on health and happiness. And interestingly, yes, there is some effects on happiness if you have low levels of health. But one of the things that is very counterintuitive about the health conundrum is that people who have chronic health issues often habituate, like we talked about, if you buy a BMW, you habituate to that BMW being a positive experience. People who have chronic health issues often habituate to their chronic health issues, and after a certain amount of time, it doesn't affect their overall happiness as much. It certainly affects their well-being as a measure, and so having a healthy diet, and there's lots of different versions of what a healthy diet might be, certainly does help. Longevity-wise, when we talked about the one study from the Brigham Young University folks and the Blue Zone study, the Blue Zone study actually found that a more plant-based diet might be better, but there is some contradictory evidence in those areas too. So overall, what I can say is that health can affect well-being, obviously, and it can, in the short term, affect happiness. But overall, people tend to actually be resilient and habituate to whatever situation they're in.
Great, thank you. And Karen, if you would please type your question in the Q&A box down below, and we'll circle back to that. Thank you.
Great. So the last thing I wanted to mention here, and please do type in your questions. I'm glad to answer them. And it often reminds me of things that I didn't cover that maybe I should have. So please do type in some questions there. The last slide here is that all these interventions we talked about, journaling, improving relationships, figuring out ways to spend money in positive ways, all are subject to the minimum effective dose principle. So I have a picture of aspirin bottles up here. They actually look like some sort of toxic chemical, but this is the royalty-free image, so forgive me. The aspirin, the reason I put aspirin up there is that if you take 2 aspirin, it's effective, but it's not more effective to take 10 aspirin for your headache. So there's a minimum effective dose of aspirin that will get you the desired outcome, which is to reduce your headache, for example. Eating more aspirin is actually detrimental to you. It can cause a bunch of problems, right? It can create ulcers and all kinds of other problems. It's like that with lots of medicines. So doctors, medical doctors, often talk about the minimum effective dose of a treatment or a medicine. And in this case, when we're talking about happiness interventions, what I would say is we need to keep a minimum effective dose in mind. So in other words, it's not that more and more money actually makes for greater happiness. It's that money to a certain point, a minimum effective dose of money actually creates greater happiness, right? And on the right-hand side, back to the PERMA model, what I would suggest is that if you wanted to pick an area or two in that model to focus on to give you the biggest bang for your buck, I would focus on relationships and meaning. Because if you improve your relationships and you improve the meaning that you find in your life, you're probably going to have positive emotions as an outcome of those relationships. You're probably going to have engagement because of the outcome of finding more meaning in your work, for example. And you'll probably find achievement when you're finding meaning. So if you focus on those two, you'll probably have a spillover effect of increasing your happiness and well-being in the other areas. So in sum, there is scientific interventions that are now being studied and discovered to increase your well-being and happiness. And this really does matter. It really does matter for businesses. It matters for policymakers, and it matters for you. And remember that there's lots of myths about happiness. You can't change a grouchy person into a perennial optimistic person, but you can help improve their happiness to a degree. Money can buy happiness in certain instances, and the way that we spend it matters. Circumstances and who we surround ourselves with often are a huge factor in our happiness. Happiness is not an individual quest, it's a social quest, and that really these things matter for leaders because as we lead organizations, as we are making policy decisions, people are really seeking after happiness and well-being in their lives, even if they don't know it. That's what they're seeking for. I thank you for coming, but I would like to answer any questions that others have typed into the chat box at this time.
Yes, we have a couple more questions here, Ted.
Great.
From Mario, happiness is defined as how much you earn or how do you spend your income?
Great. So first, happiness is defined as the emotional state that people experience, and happiness increases as people earn more income up to that $75,000 ceiling. Now, it's a different number depending on where you live. So if you live in California, it's a higher number, but that's adjusted for cost of living. So up to a certain point, increasing your income will affect and increase your happiness. The other thing that I was pointing out is that the way we spend our money also impacts whether or not we can increase our happiness. So if we are donating to charity, that's likely to increase happiness. If we are spending on experiences, that's more likely to increase happiness than purchasing things.
Excellent. And from MCF Scholar, how do people in developing countries with little to no income find happiness?
So this is a really great question. Again, it depends on the cost of living. So in Brazil, for example, hitting that threshold of annual income is going to be a lot less. But remember that the biggest predictor of happiness is social relationships. So I've been in places where income is very low and people are actually very happy, and that's because they have a great social integration and they have very strong family ties. But that's not to say that as policymakers and leaders, we shouldn't help people find ways to meet their basic needs, because that really will increase happiness and well-being.
Okay, and the next question from Jewel. In the final slide, can you explain the bullet, circumstances don't matter?
So that was on my list of myths. Circumstances do matter. So circumstances don't matter is a happiness myth. People often say conventional wisdom and sort of trite sayings is, well, you just have to think more positively. And for example, a POW who is captured by the enemy is not just going to be able to think their way out of the situation and be happier. So circumstances do influence our overall well-being and happiness. And in fact, in health, there's a lot of studies that have been done on twins because they're genetically the same. They're exactly the same twins. And what they have found is that in certain circumstances, twins who have been separated at birth, one will develop cancer and the other won't. And the only difference is that one was raised or living in a different environment than the other one. So their genetics are the same. One got cancer and one didn't, and they can attribute it very highly to environment. Same thing happens with our psychological states. As you know, hanging around with a bunch of pessimistic people often makes you pessimistic, and they've actually done studies that show that our attitudes and moods are contagious from one to another. And so those things can bring us down or bring us up.
And a follow-up question from Jewel. Is the income per household or individual?
Household. Thank you for that question.
Question from Ian. Mexico has just been listed as number 4 in the world study of happiness, and yet there is a minimum wage of 80 pesos per day, roughly about $4 US. Is this really comprehensible?
It is. Again, going back to this idea of social integration and the idea of social influence on happiness. And so if people feel like they are taken care of by each other, they often will feel greater levels of happiness. That's not to say that there might be greater levels of happiness if incomes rose some. That's certainly what the research is showing, but it's not solely dependent on income. The reason I cover money so often is because it's a very common question, and we often say, well, money can't buy happiness at all, and it's really not true. It can help to a certain point, but there are, like I said, if I were to recommend if you wanted to be happier tomorrow, what to do. I wouldn't say quit your job and find one to make more money. I would say go work on your relationships and make sure that as you are interacting in your neighborhood, that you are creating weak ties, right? They don't have to be your best friend, but do you say hello to the people around you? Are you creating a social safety net and building social capital so that if something does go awry in your life, that you'll have people to rely on? Are you part of some sort of community, either faith-based or other, that can help you sort of survive the ups and downs of life? Those are important to happiness and well-being. I think we've covered most of the questions, but I'm glad to stay on for 5 more minutes or so and answer any more.
Thank you, Dr. Cross. That was a wonderful presentation. And we would like to invite everyone to join us next month on March 15th for our follow-up presentation, Convinced, the Science of Persuasive Leadership. I'll put the information in the chat box. And also, if you would like any more information about our Master of Applied Leadership and Management, please contact me or Dr. Cross, and I'll put the contact information in.
Thank you all for attending. Have a great day.